that was certainly interesting. Super Watermelon Island and Gem Drill, the first 2 episodes of the In Too Deep special event, which is launching the Summer of Steven. Consistent, all new episodes of Steven Universe all summer. I hope Cartoon Network doesn't go back on that. This show goes on hiatus way too often. This was a double episode, a lot like The Return and Jailbreak and Mirror Gem and Ocean Gem. It wasn't quite as cohesive as either of those 2 double-length episodes, but it was perfectly fine as a double-length episode. And I gotta say, I am super excited that I got my bubbling theory up this week rather than next week, just in time for this episode to completely tear it apart. And I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter at all. All of that said, let's not kid ourselves here. A lot of us saw the leaked clip from Super Watermelon Island. We kind of had an idea of what was going to happen here. And there have been a lot of other small leaked clips and promos which have come out of scenes from this episode over the last few days. There was honestly nothing in this episode that actually surprised me. It starts out, Steven has fallen asleep and somehow he has dreamwalked into the consciousness of one of the Watermelon Stevens which have taken up residence on the island from Island Adventure. I think they called it Mask Island here. If they had elsewhere, I never caught it. And he finds out that not only have they built a little society there where they're reproducing by growing more of themselves, I guess presumably from seeds from within them, but that they have like varieties. There are male and female Watermelon Stevens apparently, and there's also Watermelon Steven dogs somehow. Oh, and what was that other thing? Oh yeah, human sacrifice. Yes, they're not human, but they are self-aware beings, so self-aware being sacrifice. Because apparently Malachite is shackled right off the shore of Mask Island and occasionally rises from the depths to demand a sacrifice of a Steven. So they will pick one from amongst them and paint it with a yellow star and put a little flower crown on its head and have Malachite eat it as a sacrifice. Which makes absolutely no sense because gems don't get hungry, don't have an instinct to eat, and neither of Malachite's component gems has any reason to be specifically angry with Steven. So I don't know why they would be specifically looking to kill Steven. But it makes for a really cool shot when, after it just so happens that Steven is the one chosen to be sacrificed, the Watermelon Steven that Steven is possessing, rather. And he is led up to the cliff where Malachite rises. We get to see her mouth come down and eat him. At which point, of course, Steven wakes up. He tells the other gems where Malachite is and kind of what's happening. Meanwhile, though, there are some tremors. Some tremors that Peridot seems to think are linked to the cluster and the fact that it's about to emerge. But the other crystal gems see Malachite as the most immediate threat, so they go ahead and warp off to Mask Island, form Alexandrite right out the gate, which was awesome. We got to see Alexandrite's entire fusion dance. And they engage Malachite in combat, and it's a really cool fight. We get to see both fusions using all of their gem weapons very effectively. But the truth is here, even though Alexandrite technically outnumbers Malachite, and even though they're technically both unstable fusions that don't really work all that well together, Malachite has been Malachite consistently for a very long time, and even though Jasper is starting to come out more and more, you can tell their psyches are kind of starting to mesh together, that something of the combined personality, the personality of the fusion, is starting to surface. And to be perfectly frank, they just have more experience being Malachite at this point than the crystal gems have being Alexandrite, and they're on the coast where Lapis Lazuli's hydrokinesis is a huge advantage, and they kind of stomp Alexandrite's butt for a while, until Steven, who has gone back to sleep to project his consciousness again into one of the Watermelon Stevens, manages to rouse them to help Alexandrite fight, manage to distract Malachite just long enough for Alexandrite to get her second wind, I guess, for lack of a better term, and she hits Malachite with an opal arrow which has the forms of the 3 crystal gems. It's actually a really cool shot. It like takes on the energy forms of the 3 crystal gems and they kind of swirl together and then shoot right through Malachite and they poof her apart. And now Jasper and Lapis Lazuli are laying there stunned. They realize that Steven is the watermelon that led the charge, so they're thanking him for helping them. And then the earth starts to open up, and Jasper falls into a crevice in the earth. And the other crystal gems realize that Peridot was right and that the cluster is about to hatch, and the warp pad was destroyed during the fight with Malachite, so they can't just warp back to help. Oops. So they basically send Steven back to tell Peridot they just need to go, just the 2 of them, and get it done. And that the crystal gems will find their way back somehow, eventually, I guess. Like, literally, the Earth is shifting so much at this point that the entire island is moving around. That's just crazy. And arguably would have done enough damage to the planet to effectively destroy it anyway, but let's not get into technicalities. And this first episode was perfectly fine, but again, like I said, I wasn't surprised by anything that happened in it, and part of that was because I had seen those leaked clips. But honestly, it wasn't all that surprising an episode in and of itself anyway. We got some really nice references to kaiju fights. We got a cool Gulliver's Travels reference in here. But overall, this was an action set piece meant to set up the next episode and remind us of the fact that Steven can project his consciousness through his dreams, and to kind of definitively prove that it was Steven himself who has that ability and it wasn't something that Malachite did, that she didn't draw him into the mind space that we saw back in Chilotite. Steven can apparently astral project, and that's kind of badass. Overall, though, there wasn't anything super spectacular story-wise in this episode, so I kind of just see it as an okay episode, an average episode of the show. The next episode, though, was anything but. The second part of this episode, Gem Drill, starts out with some really cool banter between Steven and Peridot, where some of Peridot's delightful eccentricities shine through a little bit, and they immediately jump into the drill and start digging downwards, and it's going to take about 2 hours, and thankfully we don't have to see the entire 2 hours. And finally, they break into the molten layer, and they start to be attacked by gem mutants, by fusion experiment gems. Peridot theorizes that when they buried the cluster, they must have just dropped a few of the prototypes down here for the lulz. So they activate this little cannon. It's cute. It's controlled by what looks like a Nintendo 64 or an Xbox controller. I wasn't quite sure, they were moving around a lot. Some sort of video game console controller. And they blast the gem mutants and poof them, and their gems just kind of fall out into the molten rock. And Steven doesn't like that because he wants to bubble them and protect them. And then Peridot describes exactly what shattered gems are, that they're so broken that there's literally not enough gem left in each one of them to even know who they are anymore, that they only form bodies and seek out other gems in the hopes that they might one day find the other pieces of themselves and somehow become whole again, but that doesn't seem like a thing that happens. But the point is, we are told definitively that shattered gems are not whole people, that they can't behave as whole people, and that the mutant gems, the fusion experiment gems, are effectively the same way because there's only 2 or 3 shards in them at a time, and that's not enough to make a working mind. But that's where the cluster is different. And I theorized a few different ways that the confrontation with the cluster could work out, and quite honestly, they resolved it almost exactly like I expected that they would. As they reach the cluster, which is huge and colorful and super cool looking, Peridot starts to actively drill into the cluster to try to destroy it. And Steven starts to hurt. And this is a callback to back in Horror Club when he was able to feel the emotions of the gem in the lighthouse. His gem starts glowing and he actually projects his consciousness into the mind space of the cluster and is able to kind of communicate with the individual pieces of the cluster, or at least a few of them at once. And he's able to do this without actually going to sleep or dreaming. This is the first time that we see this power used when he is not unconscious. And he is talking to the individual minds within the cluster, and he hears them calling out that they want to take form. Now, up until this point, it seems like the cluster is holding back taking a form, or it's not quite to the point where it can take a form yet. It's just starting to take one. You can really interpret it either way, but either way, it is going to form. It does want to form because, like Peridot said, it wants to seek out the other parts of itself. Even though chances are the other parts of itself are in there with it, just caught in the cacophony of noise that is all of those additional minds. And Steven tries to tell them, you don't need to find the other parts of yourself, you have all the company you could ever need right here. But they still insist that they need to form, so he suggests bubbling each of them. And he's in their mind space right now, and there are little tiny fragments floating around. I know some people are going to argue with this, I'm just going to say it right now. They're not actually floating around inside the cluster. They're all physically fused together, they can't move around. That was just a visual representation of all of the gems in there. So when he starts bubbling them one at a time, he's not actually bubbling them. He's just conceptualizing bubbling them. And when he conceptualizes it, it appears there with him in that mindscape. But basically, Steven's idea is to bubble the entire cluster and then just leave it there in stasis in the center of the Earth, basically. Which is a perfectly reasonable idea, except it's really freaking big. But after communicating the idea of bubbling the individual shards to the cluster itself, Steven is snapped back into his own body, and he tells Peridot that the cluster doesn't actually want to destroy the Earth. It doesn't actually want to form and destroy the planet, but it's not able to stop itself. He suggests bubbling it. She basically says that that would be impossible, but then they look out and they see that the individual parts are becoming bubbled, that effectively the gem shards are bubbling each other, and this is where my theory falls apart because I theorize that gems have to be taught how to bubble, and it could still be right. I'll talk about it a little bit at the end of the video. But eventually enough of them bubble each other that Steven is, I guess, able to, he's able to, bring his hands down and consolidate the bubbles into one giant rose quartz bubble, and now the cluster is in stasis. And they return to the surface, and pretty much immediately the crystal gems find a way to warp back. I don't know how they did that. But again, let's not get lost in technicalities. And they find out what Steven was able to do, and they congratulate him on stopping the cluster from forming, and they actually seem happy that he was able to find a way to stop the cluster from forming that didn't necessitate that the cluster be destroyed. And honestly, I don't even know where to begin talking about this episode. There's a lot in here. A new power of Steven's is not only confirmed, but then expanded upon almost immediately afterwards. We find out that there were enough individual mind fragments in the cluster for it to kind of act as a conscious entity, which, again, it's something that I thought might happen, but I'm really psyched that it did, because that means that the cluster is now a character that can be explored more in the future. And finally, this arc is over. The cluster arc is over. And don't get me wrong, I really liked the cluster arc, but it's gone on just long enough that it needed to end. And Lapis is back. She is brought back with the other crystal gems. She's still, I'm going to say, stunned. Now she's going to be there with them as part of the primary cast, which means we're going to get explorations into her character, and I'm super excited about that. I want to know her history so badly. Overall, this was a fun experience that's really given me a lot to think about. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a great way to start off Season 3, and it's a great way to start off the Summer of Steven. I could not be more excited to see where this is going from here on out. And now, just to address very quickly how it's possible that my bubbling theory could still be correct, it is possible that those individual gem fragments didn't actually know how to bubble until Steven kind of passed the information on to them when he showed them what bubbling was in their mind space. But I'm not going to say that that's actually what happened. All of that said, and it was quite a lot. Guys, what did you think of this episode if you have seen it? If you haven't, I have no idea why you watched this video. If you have seen it, what did you think about it? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.